And we have a guest scholar who will give a talk about the citrus belt with a focus on labor, schooling, and sort of like joy and resistance in the midst of some of the early 1900s in Riverside. And that is Professor Steven Moreno-Terrill. We'll introduce him later. All right, agenda is in the chat. If you need it, let us know. The agenda has links to the sign-in sheet, to some of the activities that we're going to be doing today. Also, there's an evaluation link there. The slide deck link will be put there at the conclusion of today's workshop.
Perfect. And before we get to the presentation, we want to start with acknowledging that as a land grant institution, UCLA History Project acknowledges the Tongva Gabrielino peoples as the traditional caretakers of the unceded land originally known as Tavangar, currently the Los Angeles Basin to the Southern Channel Islands.
And as a representative of Cal State San Bernardino, we'd like to mention that CSUSB sits on the territorial and ancestral land of the San Manuel Band of Mission Indians, the Yavatam. And we recognize that every member of the California State University San Bernardino community has benefited and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since the institution's founding in 1965. Consistent with our values of community and diversity, we have a responsibility to acknowledge and make visible the university's relationship to Native people. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty and will work to hold California State University San Bernardino more accountable to the needs of American Indian and Indigenous peoples. And of course, this is just a first step in acknowledging the land that we're on and the work that we are doing to help shed light on marginalized voices and to bring Native histories and other people's histories to the forefront is additional work that contributes to honoring the peoples whose lands we sit on.
I knew I was muted. A land acknowledgement is a statement that formally recognizes and respects the indigenous stewardship of the land and enduring the enduring relationship that exists between the indigenous peoples on that land. And it's an important social justice and decolonial practice that promotes indigenous visibility and a reminder that we are on sacred lands. And it's a movement, a beginning, a first step into learning more about the communities in which we occupy. And in that sentiment, we offer this land acknowledgement from Riverside County Office of Education. Together we stand on Turtle Island, an indigenous term for the Northern American continent. We're grateful to be able to learn on this piece of Turtle Island. Myself, I am convening on the ancestral unceded territory of the Kizh and Tongva nations and their neighbors whose ancestors tended to this region we now call Southern California for at least 9,000 years. The indigenous stewardship and rightful claims to these lands have never been voluntarily relinquished nor legally extinguished.
Thank you, Don. And we also just wanted to introduce ourselves. For some of you, it's going to be a reintroduction. And we're going to move across the screen from left to right. And so I'll go ahead and get started. My name is Danny Diaz. I am the director of the UCLA History Geography Project. I am a former high school history teacher and have lots of family that live out in the Inland Empire. So this work is meaningful to me. It aligns a lot to the vision that I have for history, which is to keep it local and to unearth some like really cool local stories and use them in classroom to engage and empower students.
And good afternoon again. My name is Cindy Mata. I'm the Associate Director at the History Project, and I'm looking forward to learning alongside y'all today.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Don Powell, administrator with Riverside County Office of Education. I deal with a lot of things, history, social science, and I dabble in a lot of other stuff. You may have seen me around. If not, hopefully you will. And I'm looking forward to today as well.
Hi, I'm Michelle Larmer. I'm a lecturer at Cal State San Bernardino, just helping to facilitate and provide some historian perspective on this project. So super happy to be here with you all.
And I'm Amparo Chavez Gonzalez. I am the lead facilitator and a coach for the UCLA History Geography Project. Excited to be here with everyone. So we want to make sure that for those of you who are here for the first time, that we share with you the goals of the TPS workshops. This series of workshops is sponsored in part by the Library of Congress. And so we're going to share some of those resources with you. We're going to create inquiry activities and look at primary sources from the Library of Congress, or we like to call it the LLC. We're going to be doing a lot of analysis of primary sources and talking a lot about how we create inquiry and use the inquiry process in social studies history. Next. And so this series is called Eastside Stories, and it's really about taking history and making it local and covering the hidden history of the Inland Empire, right? Talking with scholars and hearing from them. We want to emphasize the stories of groups that are often not covered in your textbooks or throughout traditional history courses. We want to highlight examples of resiliency, agency, and advocacy from the stories and the narratives that we're going to be learning about. And then it's going to also be a place for us to learn with one another, check out resources, literacy strategies, and look for ways of integrating that, what we learn into the K-12 history and ethnic studies classrooms. And so we are excited to have you all here for this learning today. And we're excited to hear from you when you use the stuff that the scholars, the historians share. Please let us know, send us an email and tell us, hey, I tried this, it bombed, or hey, I tried this and it worked. It's okay, we like either one. We just like to know that this labor of love from our historians and from our colleagues actually helps you in your classroom.
All right, thank you, Amparo. So we're gonna go ahead and kick things off by doing a map analysis activity. Before I get into this, I just wanna talk a little bit about, actually not talk a little bit about it, I just wanna emphasize the importance of signing in today, just because like Amparo said, this is a project that is funded by the Library of Congress and the Teaching of Primary Sources program. And the way that they document and gauge the success of a program and continue to provide funding is based on the amount of participants. And so you signing in is very important for us. So please do so if you haven't had a chance to. And I see that, Liz, we'll drop the agenda and the sign-in link as well in the chat for those of you who just joined us. Okay, so let me pivot to this map analysis activity. You might have noticed that the flyer we use to promote this workshop features a background that's a blurred out map. It's also featured on this slide deck. We feature that map for a reason. It highlights a lot of the topics that this series has discussed and will discuss. The map is also really fascinating. It provides a lot of insights into some unique history to the Inland Empire. In this particular case, this map comes from Riverside. So we thought, considering today's topic and how important this particular map is to the topic, and we're going to learn more about, the map will probably be referenced in some way, shape, or form during the talk. We thought, why not spend time doing some exploration of this particular map? So if we can go into the next slide. So I know that this is blurry, I'm going to provide you links to a better version of this map, but the map is, it's a Sanborn map. And from what I know, and again, our historian you can feel free to unmute and chime in if you want, but these Sanborn maps were produced by an insurance company. I believe it was Fire Insurance. And they created these really detailed maps of various communities that captured a lot of history that has in some communities been erased or forgotten. And so the Sanborn maps are great because they reveal a lot about some of this lost or forgotten or ignored history. So this particular map comes from the Library of Congress website. It's actually in two sections. There's section 49 or page 49 and then section 50. Right? And so I'm not going to give you too much information about the map because what I want you all to do is spend 3 to 5 minutes exploring this map. And exploring, to articulate what that means, it's just noting the landmarks. You can jot notes down somewhere, just take down notes on a Post-it note, but what are you seeing? What kind of landmarks are in this map? What are the names of the roads? In addition to roads, are there other means of transportation on this map? What is the map revealing to you about Riverside? If you had to guess what this map is of, you can take one of those guesses, but go ahead and spend like 3 to 5 minutes exploring this map. And the chat is going to feature I think, no, it hasn't been done. Okay, so here is the link to the first part of the map. All right, so there's the link to the first, oops, I sent that directly to somebody. There it is. Right, so if you click on that, I'll take a moment to let you do that. It'll take you to a Library of Congress webpage. Okay, and what you should see, it should say image 50 of Sanborn fire insurance map from Riverside County, California. Okay. Now you can toggle the expand or decrease feature if you want to zoom in. You can click the arrows pointing diagonally to just make it full page. And if you want, you can even download it as a JPEG, a super JPEG, a GIF, or whatever a TIFF is. You can download them to explore, okay? They're very detailed, so you want to spend a lot of time and make sure that you're sort of scouring all corners of that particular map. So that's the first one, and then here's the second page. I believe this is page 50. So you can spend some time looking at that as well. Okay, so again, just spend 3 to 5 minutes exploring these maps, noting landmarks, names, roads, etc., and then thinking about what does this map tell you about Riverside? What are you learning? Okay, so right now it's 4:17 according to my iPad. I'll check in with you all at 4:20, seeing if you all need some more time, and if you do, I'll give you a couple more minutes at that point. So feel free to unmute or raise your hand emoji if you have any questions. This is going to set up a conversation that we're going to have. We're going to have more specific questions for you about this map after we come back together. Okay, I don't see any hand raised. All right, so go ahead, enjoy exploring this map, and I'll check in with you all in a few minutes. All right. You can go ahead and give a hand raise if you need more time, and then I'll just kind of scroll through and see who needs time to continue exploring. And if it looks like we're done exploring, we'll go ahead and get into our discussion. So I'm looking, I don't see any hands raised.
We already have some comments in the chat.
I see that, yeah. Okay, great. Let me scroll through one more time. Thank you, Liz. Thank you for seeing that. Yes. Okay. Great. Well, I know a lot of you are continuing to explore that map. Feel free to do so as our conversation continues. But we were thinking a lot about this map because it revealed a whole lot to us. So we're going to go ahead and look at some more targeted questions that we want to hear a response from you all about some of the things that we were thinking. So if we can move the next slide. So I'm looking at the comments, and you can continue to chat in the comments, but we're I think we're a small enough group where we can just unmute and we have time for maybe a couple of comments. But what is this map revealing to you about Riverside in the 1900s? And if you can focus it on housing, transportation, labor, economics, or race, that would be great. But if there's another revelation that you have, you can also share that. So who would like to share? And again, if you don't want to unmute, you all can share in the chat as well. I'm just encouraging you to unmute and share. Sandra, I see that. Sandra is saying that she sees, they say fruit and packing houses, boarding houses, the drug building, I'm assuming a pharmacy. Yes, that's a good assumption. The train station, good eye, you caught that. So the assumption is it's a farming and packing fruit, citrus, specifically a citrus town. Thank you, Sandra, good eye. Liz, map 51 has a Japanese note in the bottom right corner. So I don't know if you all caught that. But what is that about? You might be asking yourself. Why does it say Japanese at the bottom of map 51? Irene is also noticing the packing houses next to the railroad tracks in the Casa Blanca neighborhood.
Danny, Serene
Yeah,
has their hand up.
Oh, sorry. Okay, go ahead and share.
Serene, do you want to share? No.
Sorry, I couldn't find my unmute button. I had a question actually. I saw on I think it's 49, maybe it's not 49. One of the buildings on the map, on one of the maps is red, and I was wondering what does that color differentiation mean? I think it's on 49. It's like on the right-hand side, there's like number 406. I think.
Yeah, I do see that.
Does that mean something special?
Let's see. Well, I don't know the answer. If not to put you on the spots, Professor Moreno-Terrill, but if you know the significance of that color, let us know. It's right off of Cary, right? Cary and Evans.
Yeah, that one.
Yeah.
Let me see. I don't think I'm queued up. Danny, could you pop it on the screen?
Yeah, let me
If it's
here, let me drop the link for you, Professor, and then you can explore, and maybe if you come to any sort of conclusion, because right now it just looks like it's red for the sake of being red. I don't know what it signifies. But great, yeah, maybe we could get down to the bottom of that. Anybody else noticing anything, or is this revealing anything about transportation? I think we're getting around to some of that, right? We're seeing that this is packing house. There's a train station. The packing houses are next to the railroad tracks. This is a theme we talk a lot about, especially in like 8th grade and 11th grade, right? About shipping and the movement of commerce and how important railroads were and continue to be in that process. And then the labeling of Japanese in the corner, right, reveals something about race, right? And if you had to guess, you'd probably guess, oh, maybe that is like some housing designated for Japanese folks. And if that was what your assumption was, then yeah, you are correct. And these maps, and I'm gonna pass it off to Amparo in a second. These maps are part of I think 61 different maps. They're huge, and the Library of Congress scanned them into sections. If you scan other parts of the map, like the Eastside neighborhood, you'll see different segments of those neighborhoods with the words of the different racial groups where they were sort of designated. Some of those, the wording, the language used is a language that we wouldn't find acceptable today, but you'll see that in throughout the map. And today the talk is going to give you some more historical context to that. So Amparo, you want to talk to us about more present day maps of these areas?
Yes, please. And if you can put the link, I would appreciate it. So Cindy, can you hit click? One more time, please. So here's a current day map that is found in the county website. And we're gonna give you the link to, I copied the map and then what it says about the community for you. And so as you look at, or you read the description of Casa Blanca there, you really want to think about what you're noticing about the narrative that is in that description of the community from your Riverside County website. Okay, so we're going to give you a couple minutes. It's really short. The map is about half of the page. Okay, so go ahead and take a look, and then we're going to come back and we're going to talk about a little bit of a comparison between what we looked at first and what we know about Casa Blanca, and then what the county has put up about the history of Casa Blanca. 3 minutes, here comes the music. All right, if we could all come back. Yeah, I already saw one comment, right? That there's a difference between Casa Blanca already and Eastside, that they are in fact different communities. What do you notice about the narrative that is on this website for the county, which was updated last time in 2015? If anyone can, if you want to put something in the chat, that'll be great. If you want to unmute, that would be great as well. What do you notice about this narrative and the one that you probably know yourself about the community? And yes, absolutely. Somebody put the name is in Spanish. Yes. A very family, right? Friendly community, absolutely. Housing is low density, yes, right? I'm curious, what do you notice about what it's saying about the racial makeup of the community and the historical racial makeup of that community? Anyone? Somebody put Hispanic. So there's train issues. There's no mention of any agricultural background for sure, right? And if you look at this, it talks about Henry Benedict Lockwood being the first home there. And then it talks about in 1889, S.C. Evans created a subdivision, right? It definitely talks about it being a strong knit community. It talks about community activism and things that were done to enrich the community, right? And when you read this description, there's very little mention of the fact that the community is historically considered a Mexican-American community, except for the names of the parks and some of the community leaders. There's very little that mentions that. Yeah, there's very little conversation about the Mexican-American community that historically has been, right, the basis for life in Casa Blanca. And so I want you to think about how we share that kind of narrative with the students that we work with and what it means for them to know about the deep roots of many of their families in this community and the importance of it. As we think about today, you can go to the county websites and you can look up Eastside, you can look up Arlington Heights. They have detailed maps and they have descriptions of each community if you want to compare. And it gives you an idea of also historically how much people and what people have done to attract people to the Inland Empire, right? And so what is that narrative that we want to share? We want to bring commerce to the Inland Empire, if we want to bring workers to the Inland Empire, and if we want to bring more investment. It's a way for us to think about, especially I know in the high school level, we can have those conversations. It's important. All right. Thank you, those of you who shared. Appreciate it.
All right. We are going to ask you before we get started, because we're about to introduce our historian, to change your name. I'm sorry, not to change your name, like actually, but just to like let us know whether you are here as an elementary teacher, middle school teacher, high school teacher, or ethnic studies teacher. And the way you're going to let us know that is by updating the name in Zoom by clicking on the bottom of the screen, and then click on your name. So first click on the bottom of the screen where it says participants. Then the next step is to click on your name. And your name should be at the top. And then once you do that, you're going to follow the steps on the next slide. And step 5 is the key. If you're an elementary teacher, you're going to put EL. If you are middle school, MS. High school, HS, ethnic studies, ES. This will help us put you in the correct breakout room so that you can interact and talk with folks that teach the same grade level as you do.
And then as you guys go ahead and get your name changed, I'll go ahead and introduce Steven Moreno-Terrill, our scholar for this evening. Steve is a proud member of the college Chicanx ethnic studies instructor with a decade of experience proving culturally relevant and anti-racist instruction to a diverse community college students in Southern California. His specialties as an educator include Chicanx, ethnic studies, curriculum development, racial justice, literacy, anti-racist and decolonizing praxis, critical place-based and service learning pedagogies, and Hispanic serving institutions. He's also a Chicanx public historian with 6 years of experience in oral history, community archiving, digital humanities, historic interpretation and preservation, museum exhibit development, and public programming. His current roles in this capacity include community historian for Riverside County Mexican American Historical Society and education committee member for Latinos and Heritage Conservation. As a scholar of race, place, and memory, Steve's research specializations and interests in the field of Chicanx studies and history focus on Mexican American and BIPOC communities of the Inland Empire in Southern California. His specific interests include Chicanx educational history, with education broadly conceived to include institutional and community pedagogies, as well as cultural memory work, looking at segregated schools, fiestas, patrias, historical societies, family reunions, historical preservation, and museum interpretation and ethnic studies programs. He is currently developing a pilot project called the Southern California Latinx Public Humanities Institute that interlinks community college Chicanx and ethnic studies curriculum with public history, humanities, and racial justice literature to cultivate ecologies of critical race praxis. This work intends to disrupt settler colonial imaginaries, decolonize public humanities, and provide community college students with empowering opportunities to build racial justice literacies and reshape their cultural landscapes in critical ways. The two regions of focus for the project are the Inland Empire and Riverside City College in San Diego with Mira Costa and Mesa colleges. With that, take it away, Steven.
All right. Thank you, Don. I appreciate that. All right. Let me get my screen fired up. I hope everyone's doing well. Aha, okay. There we go. We're good. You can see. Okay, cool. It's tough when you're juggling multiple screens. All right. Let me get the chat up so that I can also kind of stay abreast of any input from the group. All right, so we're looking good. Okay, everyone. Once again, thanks for being here. Thanks for signing up for this session. I'm really happy. A big fan of the work that Danny and the rest of the team have been doing. How long has it been? I mean, at least like, I feel like 2 years. I don't know, 2 years, right? And I've been a big fan of this work and really just trying to participate in all the offerings that y'all have been doing. And it's definitely helped me grow as an educator and a researcher. So I'm just happy to share some of the work that I've done, research on the Inland Empire. So definitely thank you for the invitation, and I'm happy to be here. Okay, so the title of my presentation, as you can see, is The Borderlands of Race, Place, and Citizenship in Riverside's Citruscape. And so Riverside is part of the region that we refer to as the Inland Empire, or if you want to get fancy, Inland Southern California, I think is the people are starting to utilize. And what this presentation will entail is a brief history of the transformations in the landscape concerning the rise of the citrus industry, but also taking up the process of settler colonialism in the city of Riverside and in the region broadly, as well as the politics of the racial politics of place and knowledge, with a specific focus on segregated schooling. And so through the latter half of this presentation, I'll take up segregated schools in Riverside in the neighborhoods that we've discussed already. But to start off, I will give us a little context for the first portion before our breakout session. So about 15, 20 minutes of discussion on the history of Riverside as what I denote here, a citruscape. And that's just a combination, the cultural landscape of citrus essentially is what I'm referring to with that term. And then discussion in terms of the distinctions between a fantasy heritage landscape and then the reality of hidden histories in the landscape that are obscured by fantasy heritage, and then peeling back that veil of fantasy to really highlight those hidden histories of race and place, discussing historically minoritized ethno-racial groups, in particular Black, Indigenous, communities of color, who were essential for the growth and rise of the industry and the development of the city. But also the ways that, because it's my specialty, the ways that Mexican American communities navigated and resisted the process of settler colonialism and internal colonialism through various cultural practices and resources. All right, so, but I also want to kind of get us calibrated with some guiding questions. So I have two here, just as generative inquiry questions to provide a framework for our thinking as we explore this history and the racial politics of place. I'd like for you to consider in what ways the racial hierarchy and specifically because racial hierarchy in the United States has historically been one of white supremacy. And so it's important that we don't render racism and race as neutral constructs, but that we ground them historically and associate them with the particular hierarchy that is in place and that has been in place as a result of settler colonialism, and that is white supremacy. But how is that built into the physical and cultural landscape? So taking up the ideas of race and place and trying to think through and visualize and understand the dynamics of how those two things are intertwined, and how place structures race and how race structures spaces in the city. And not just physically, but culturally as well. Thinking about symbolic dimensions of social life. And then beyond that question, how did people create a sense of belonging, identity, and a sense of freedom in Riverside? So among the various groups that we'll consider, certainly we'll start with talking about the white settler population briefly, but how did the other groups and those historically minoritized ethno-racial groups that I'll be focusing on, and in particular Mexican Americans, how did they create a sense of belonging in this particular context that's structured around white supremacy? How they navigate, negotiate, disrupt, and transform within their own communities using cultural resources and different forms of capital that they had available to them. Okay, so to begin with, I'd like for us to explore the ideas of a settler colonial imaginary and the use of what is termed fantasy heritage as a dominant discourse, a spatial rhetoric of Riverside that has persisted from the late 19th century to this day. And so I will provide a brief description of this framework, and then also chart where in the landscape and how it's deployed symbolically to do the work of structuring place around racial ideology, okay? Using cultural tools and also physical built environment as well. Okay. One second. Now, while the place that we know of currently as the city of Riverside has always been and is still on indigenous land, this landscape has been subject to successive colonial and settler colonial regimes that have subjected indigenous populations, Black populations, and other communities of color to violence, land dispossession, exploitation, and erasure as part of the process of land acquisition, national and economic expansion, and the imposition of a hierarchical racial system structured around Anglo and Eurocentrism, which then produces the structures of white supremacy in a systematic fashion. So this land has been constructed in this way, and it has been at the expense through the process of settler colonialism, dependent on violent processes that I've indicated here. And so I'd like to explore that a little bit through the ideas of settler imaginaries and fantasy heritage. All right, so when we consider the construct of settler colonialism, I've indicated these various elements to that process of a dominant regime that comes to settle on the landscape and displaces indigenous populations and dispossesses them, and then acquires the land and then structures the land accordingly to the dominant interests, certainly. But in addition to violence and physical processes, the symbolic processes are just as important to that established order, in that to create a relationship to the land and to legitimize that relationship and establish an ideal type of citizenship based around a new narrative, a new relationship, is fundamental to sustaining and reproducing that social order. And so the symbolic terrain of Riverside was constructed and transformed throughout the late 19th century and early 20th century to facilitate an ideological transformation in the landscape, so that the settlers of Riverside would be able to see themselves in this place as the rightful inhabitants, and all others who are not identified as Anglo-European or white as the other. And so this is done through particular narrative and visual devices, certainly, and through something called fantasy heritage, which is a term coined by Carrie McWilliams, investigative journalist, who he went hard on the Citruscape, and he had a strong critique against communities such as Riverside in the ways that they perpetuated a fantasy heritage and exploitative relations. And so this idea of fantasy heritage really is about, and pardon me, let me get us to the next slide, is about rendering the landscape in ways that obscure past violence, that center the industriousness and ideal citizenship of white settlers and communities, okay? Erase the indigenous populations and those non-white populations that are part of the landscape and integral to the landscape's formation, erase and delegitimize those populations in the narratives and through the symbolic resources. And then package that up as a product to be sold in the marketplace, which I'll talk about shortly, okay? What we see here is these idealized renderings of the Inland Empire and Riverside in particular that comprised what I refer to as the citrus lore, the lore of the landscape, that are those origin stories that do the work of producing and circulating the fantasy that I'm discussing. And so here, one of the central figures of that is Eliza Tibbets. And she's credited as the sort of mother of the navel orange industry and its arrival to Riverside, which then made history. And so, you know, the lore of the land of Riverside is that she was sent a navel orange tree, which was native to Bahia, Brazil, after thousands of years of evolution, beginning in China. So all citrus fruit comes from China, but this particular type of orange, the navel orange, which Riverside is known for, came from Brazil through a position in the US Department of Agriculture called fruit scouts or fruit explorers, where they would go around the world and try to identify exotic fruits that could be sold in the marketplace and cultivated throughout the United States. And so her friend, William Saunders, who was one of the leaders of the US Department of Agriculture, sent her a few specimens of this tree. And lo and behold, the tree loved the climate and soil of Riverside. And from there began to grow as not only a agricultural phenomenon, but a cultural one as well. And so in these postcards, you can see a glimpse of the idyllic landscape, a sort of pastoral scene where the groves surrounding the estate are presented as part of the California dream. And that's rendered also in what we see here in this citrus label. But I want to also draw your attention to this historic landmark, which is found on Magnolia and Arlington. The original tree that she was sent from William Sanders, the parent navel tree, still exists today. And I don't know if I mentioned it, but this occurred in 1873. So that tree, one of the trees that she was sent, is still alive today on the corner of Arlington and Magnolia, and is commemorated here in this postcard, but certainly marked in the landscape as an icon of this heritage that I'm discussing. And when I mentioned ideal type citizens, what that meant in the late 19th and early 20th century was a citizenship centered around whiteness, certainly, but also around key ideas of modernity, which involved industriousness and also scientific knowledge, and the view that the expansion of Western civilization was rightfully culminating here in this western coast of the United States to finalize the process of manifest destiny and what we're referring to here as settler colonization. Okay, and so here Uncle Sam is depicted as a key icon in terms of American imagery, but paired with the idea, the text as it indicates here, I grow these myself, to reflect an ethos of individualism and industriousness associated with capitalism and the development of the landscape in ways that are seen as superior and that enabled and justified the taking over of the land from indigenous peoples, as well as the Mexican government, because this land was also for a period of time Spain and then Mexico. Okay, so these are the kind of representative examples. Someone's trying to get in. Oh, you got that? Okay, cool. Of some of the iconography of this fantasy heritage, which is just a way of talking about the past that sparks nostalgia and a longing to be a part of that place, part of that fantasy. And so we could see it in today's landscape, certainly, but there are key ideas associated with this and iterations when we think about fantasy heritage. I refer to it as the iconography of place here, but I'll direct you to some key things that are present in Riverside that really signify part of the stories that I'm talking about. So Eliza Tibbetts here in the statue in the downtown mall. And really, I wish I would have put the Manifest Destiny, the classic picture of the woman hovering over the landscape with the Bible. I don't know if anyone's seen that next to this, because the way that Eliza is talked about and represented is similar to the imagery of Manifest Destiny. So she's commemorated American progress. Yes, absolutely. Thank you. We see buildings in the city center. And so the administrative offices of the city of Riverside adorned with this iconography of place, this fantasy heritage that represented here in crate labels, but also the Spanish fantasy past, which I haven't mentioned yet, but that is a key component to fantasy heritage that is dominant in what we're talking about, what we're looking at. This idea of a connection to the Spanish era of California as something to look back to connect the region to a history that goes back before the 19th century. and really trying to connect like a historic legacy in European heritage to this place of Riverside. And so here we see a statue erected in 1940 of Juan Bautista de Anza, who was a conquistador who trekked through the region all the way to San Francisco in 1774. And this connection to the actual history was rendered in ways that perpetuated the Spanish fantasy. There were no significant Spanish settlements in this region. He was just passing through with his group, crossing the Santa Ana River, and that site is also commemorated. But that simple fact gave a sort of legitimacy to the fantasy heritage, and it was commemorated once the research revealed that, commemorated here in this statue erected in 1940, which then followed with a series of festivals, or what was called the Danza Days festivals throughout the 1940s to commemorate this recently discovered connection of the actual Spanish history in the region to really give credence to that fantasy. So we see it through these things, but certainly the crate labels, while they're capturing the imagery, the desirable imagery of a pastoral and idyllic landscape, one that fuses industriousness with a agricultural sense. There's also racial imagery that is found in these crate labels that are still looked on to this day with a high level of nostalgia, and these are collectors' items. We see how people of color fit into this fantasy through the crate labels, such as the ones indicated here. And as you can see, the padre representing the arrowhead crate, beckoning you to enter the landscape, holding navel oranges, and in the background you see the idyllic landscape. And if you notice, the arrowhead is the forced frame through which you view it and then enter it as well. So appropriating indigenous cultural symbols to do the work of perpetuating a fantasy, to position consumers and primarily white consumers in a very strategic way. But it wasn't limited to indigenous appropriation. We see the racial imagery play out here, certainly through the trope of fiestas, connecting to the fandangos of the Spanish era, but also, the more racialized othering of images such as the one found here in the Sombrero brand, of a darker skin child partaking of the citrus fruit. And so this racialized imagery is part of that fantasy work, but it's also in the built environment as well, to harken back to that past that was constructed as desirable, to create Riverside as a desirable place for people to settle and for people to visit. Architecture was fundamental to that. And so through Spanish colonial revival architecture, certainly there's no shortage of it in Riverside or in the region. This played into that. And so here we see Sherman Institute, the Native American boarding school, which is on Magnolia, and then the famed Mission Inn, Frank Miller's Mission Inn, Frank Miller being instrumental to ushering forth that fantasy heritage of Riverside, to create a tourist complex in what Nathan Gonzalez calls ethnotourism, but certainly the white settler imaginary structuring tourist relationships to the land. And you could purchase a home and live the fantasy if you choose to reside here. And so here are some key features indicated in this magazine article or advertisement. And here's some historic mansions in Riverside. One here in this historic image, but also connecting to other markers of the landscape, not just the groves and the architecture, but also palm trees. Palm trees symbolizing that California dream and that idyllic landscape, which typically lined the paths, the driveways to the mansions or growers' estates, and to signify who was in charge and to bridge the gap between fantasy and reality for the dominant class. And here we see a rendering of a citrus grower's estate, and it's called the Anchorage. And this one is owned by, it's representative of a house owned by Judge Brown, who later on ran his own packing operation. And so the Anglo settlers who started the industry were certainly men of means who came to this area with capital and were part of a professional class who maintained, in many instances, their professions and ran citrus operations as well. But that wasn't the case for everyone. There's different scales, but typically what we see here, that was the case. Okay, and I'll wrap it up to bridge us to the next section. All right, so in terms of tourism, the fantasy was definitely a tourist draw, and we see that in these artifacts here, which are connected to something called the Orange Empire Trolley Tour, which ran from roughly about 1908 to the mid-20s. And so as part of a Pacific Electric Railway line that brought tourists to Riverside to partake in the idyllic landscape and to get away and to travel through the groves and visit the Mission Inn and all of Frank Miller's tourist creations that were found in the landscape, the Sherman Institute being one of them, but also a zoo and some other features that he was instrumental in creating to produce this fantasy as a draw for tourists. And so we see the pamphlet here. All right. So I will go ahead and pause there, and that is just some setup in terms of Riverside as a fantasy space, a place constructed around these ideas in service of settler colonialism, and how the iconography of that fantasy heritage maps into the landscape and what its functions are for preserving the dominant racial hierarchy, and also as a way of positioning residents and tourists alike. And so the next section will be on hidden histories, but we have a breakout room, and I'll go ahead and pass it along to the coordinators for that.
Thank you, Professor Moreno-Terrill. All right, folks, so we're going to go ahead and get into a breakout room, and remind me, is there a question or something that, because what we would like you to do is think about what you just heard and then connecting it to your instruction, your teaching, your pedagogy. But Professor Moreno-Terrill, is there a question or sort of artifact that you would like them to also think about as they have this discussion?
You know what? Yeah. So let's think about this fantasy scape that I just talked about. And where can we land on? Okay, so this is a good one here. I have postcards, crate labels, and kind of a solid chunk of that citrus lore that we can refer to for the breakout session.
Okay, great. So again, it's some of these postcards that that we're looking at, and then also just connecting to your classroom. What are we learning? What's new? How might it be informing the way you teach, or what is it sort of what maybe does it attach to something that you're already teaching, where you could layer in some of this history into your current units or lessons? Okay. Thank you, Cindy, for that. So Mark is he's organizing the breakout rooms. You're going to be in a breakout room with a few other people, and you can engage in that discussion at that point.
Okay, we're back. Yeah, okay, cool. All right, everyone. I hope your conversations went well. All right, so now we covered the fantasy heritage of the Citruscape. Let's talk about what that fantasy is obscuring and what it's hiding, okay? And so the idea of hidden histories really is an important one to disrupt and demystify that fantasy, and also to highlight the histories of minoritized ethno-racial groups or BIPOC communities. So the citrus industry is credited in large part for inland Southern California's economic growth and development during the 19th and early 20th centuries, certainly. In fact, Riverside was touted as the wealthiest city in the nation per capita in 1895, okay? But however, citrus growers, many of whom were already well-educated, as I mentioned, middle and upper class Anglo gentleman farmers, as they were known, were not solely responsible for the rising fortunes that made the region known as the Orange Empire. As this imperial moniker suggests, the labor-intensive industry depended upon a large, low-wage labor force of men and women for irrigation, planting, picking, packing, shipping, and a variety of other tasks involved in what eventually grew into an industrial agricultural system. So these migrant and immigrant workers of different ethnicities were forced to navigate a racially and economically stratified landscape to make it all possible. And Native Americans were among the first to work in the early development of citrus production. And while some African Americans also worked to clear the land and plant orchards, Chinese immigrant men served as the primary large-scale labor force through the latter part of the 19th century, when the industry, the navel orange industry, was proliferating. And that came to an end with the rise of anti-Chinese racism, and resulting in the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. We see the populations of Chinese laborers diminished and be pushed out of the area. There are also Chinatowns in Riverside, San Bernardino, and Rancho Cucamonga, just to note. But with the displacement of Chinese populations from the region, Japanese men replaced them as the main source of labor throughout the turn of the century, until they too faced racist nativism and exclusionary policies. And so for the early part of the 20th century, it was Japanese immigrants who filled that gap in the labor force, until the racial politics once again emerged and pushed them out. But other groups such as Korean, Filipino, Sikh, Italian immigrants also worked in the industry to lesser degrees during the early 20th century. However, as immigration from Mexico increased, a result of the Mexican Revolution, certainly between 1910 and 1917, Mexican immigrants and Mexican Americans became the majority of the workforce through the industry's decline after World War II. So it was Mexican labor that really saw the industry through the 20th century. And it was the growers were dependent upon Mexican populations. From the early days of production in the late 1800s, Chinese and Japanese immigrant men picked and packed the fruit, okay? But just after the turn of the century, the racial and gendered landscape of labor transitioned to where white women became the ideal, naturally suited workforce in the packing houses, leaving men outdoors in the harsh elements of the groves and women inside the packing houses, which were equally as harsh, sorting, grading, wrapping, and packing the fruit at a lower wage even than men's meager pay. And so from the 20s through the World War II era, that transitioned to Mexican American women, who became the primary packing house labor force. and where they fostered community within that space while they're engaged in repetitive, rigorous, cold, loud conditions. In that environment, they were able to maintain social relationships with one another. But out in the groves, the picking crews, comprised the bulk of the industry's labor force, which was paid per crate picked. So we're talking 3 to 5 cents, early 20th century. And with some men being able to pick 100 crates a day if they're really skilled and had good health. And these were called the campeones, the champions, those who were able to do this. And they earned the most money. And much of the fruit grown along the citrus belt of inland Southern California consisted of winter harvest varieties, the Washington Navel, case in point, being the most prominent. But another job that men had, and also local area youth, was lighting the smudge pots as well, those heaters that were found throughout the groves filled with oil, which then made the skies black with soot, covering the landscape in a thick soil in the cold winter months to protect the trees from freezing, the fruit from freezing. Another thing to note is that the growers were forming associations to consolidate production and pool their resources, and to control labor. And so the citrus growers associations, and the most popular one being Sunkist, were part of a conglomeration of smaller growers who then came together and formed these large exchanges and were able to more effectively dominate and control the labor force. All right, so let me get us to some more. And as you can see, some of the aspects that I've mentioned represented here, Mexican-American women in the packing house, African-Americans early on, and we see have some archival resources, and the work of Megan Suster has taken this up, African-Americans in the citrus industry, as well as other aspects, which I'll get to, and especially when we're talking about conflict, labor struggles and rights. Okay. Oh, pardon me. So the rise of the citrus production in inland Southern California drew many migrant and immigrant workers to this labor-intensive industry. The workers came to work in the industry as a pull factor, bringing various communities, various men primarily, and then their families later on, to work in this area, establishing themselves in bunkhouses or labor camps, which were typically situated near the groves and packing houses. But eventually they were able to form stable but separate ethnic enclaves or racialized segregated communities. And some of the labor camps were maintained by the growers associations. But ultimately, in terms of Mexican-American communities, which we'll take up shortly, it was home ownership which enabled the growth of a stable labor community. All right, I want to be mindful of time and take us through some of the different populations. I mentioned the Sherman Institute, which is an important combination of what we mentioned in terms of settler colonialism, displacement of indigenous populations, but also the containment and controlling and Americanizing of this non-white population as part of the transformation of the landscape. But we can also see Chinese laborers and the communities that they formed as significant populations that still have traces in the landscape to this day. And so as Chinese immigrant men transitioned from working on the railroads to the citrus industry in the mid to late 1800s, they settled in communities throughout the citrus belt. And pictured here, we could see Riverside's FB Divine Packing House. Chinese laborers, interestingly, were incredibly adept to bring their cultural knowledge to, because as I said, citrus started in China. So these Chinese immigrants had knowledge of cultivation and harvesting. So that cultural knowledge was valuable to growers. And so these Chinese laborers were working both in the packing houses and in the groves, facilitating the ideal methods of cultivating and harvesting the fruit. And so here we see an image of Riverside's Chinatown, which is within the Tecasquite Arroyo, down the street from Riverside Community College. And we see some Chinese pickers and packers in the groves here in Riverside. But in terms of other groups that were part of this landscape, this racialized landscape, it's important to mention the Korean settlement known as the Pachapa Camp, which was one of the first significant Korean settlements in the United States, as researched by Dr. Ed Chang of UCR's Ethnic Studies Department. And so this community lasted from 1905 to 1913, forming a settlement of citrus workers and their families, forming churches, schools, and for a short time, building a life here in Riverside. And Dosan An Chang Ho is one of the community leaders that is commemorated in the landscape in downtown. There's a statue of him in the pedestrian mall. There's nearly 300 residents. Japanese workers primarily resided in the labor camps and the bunkhouses, and then were interspersed in the other communities of color, and primarily Mexican American communities. But there was no solid formation of what is known as Japantown in Riverside. And here we see Japanese worker housing in Arlington, which is a small community on Indiana. Okay, so now we've talked about the historic Mexican communities, Casa Blanca, Eastside. I also want to put on our radar Arlington South. Okay, so this is another small, lesser known Mexican community that is important to recognize, and we'll unpack that right now. Okay, and how much, I want to do a time check.
Just a little over 6 minutes.
6 minutes left? Okay. So as the Mexican immigrant community began to flourish in the early part of the 20th century, taking its place as the primary labor force in the citrus industry, what we see is those settlement patterns that we've identified in these communities, but another type of management and segregation also was taking place as these populations increasingly migrated and immigrated to Riverside. The Anglo population saw this as a situation to manage. And one of the ways they managed that was not only through segregated housing, and this was by way of restrictive covenants, and also selling land that was right next to the groves at a low price to ensure that they lived in segregated areas apart from whites. Schools were another way of containing and controlling and ultimately maintaining the racial hierarchy in Riverside. And so segregated schooling is an important aspect to consider when we think about the history of race and place in Riverside as it's connected to the citrus industry. And so here there are 3 schools associated with the communities that we've been discussing. As you can see, the Irving School in the upper right corner, and then Casa Blanca, and then Independiente, which is a little known school and one of the focuses of my research in uncovering that hidden history of that specifically created what was called Mexican school at the time to siphon off the Mexican students from the white school, which was the Liberty School in Arlington, and separate them from the white students. In terms of the racial climate as well, though Mexicans were viewed positively by growers as an ideal workforce, there was also other racial ideologies that informed the landscape and the racial climate. And so part of the hidden histories also involves recognizing and identifying places in the landscape that white supremacy in its most explicit form manifested. And so the Ku Klux Klan was experiencing a resurgence throughout Southern California in the early part of the 20th century, and had a chapter in Riverside, as well as chapters in San Bernardino and throughout the region. And so in 1924, they held a rally where thousands attended a huge event at Poly High, which was now, which at the time was located where RCC, Riverside City College is, where thousands were in attendance, and a plane dragged a flaming cross across the sky as part of the spectacle of white citizenship that marked that event. And so it was initiation of new Klan members held at this site. And then a year later, in 1925, from this site of education, the Klan took its activities to downtown Riverside, holding a parade where once again, thousands from around the region and the city attended. Another part of the racial climate and racial ideology was something called the Mexican problem. And this is a phenomenon that was not limited to Riverside, also something that occurred throughout the Southwest, but portraying Mexicans as a problem to be dealt with. And this was a discursive framework that you saw in newspapers, but also in social science research and other aspects of the city's social life. And so Mexicans were a problem in need of solving. And one of the ways that this was done was through education and cultivation of sorts. And Americanization served that function, as well as segregated school spaces. Casa Blanca, an important educational site, but also connection to the history of race and place in Riverside, and also stories of resilience. The formation of this school was not initiated by white families or white community members. It was in fact created by a petition that was submitted by two women known as Las Adelitas de Casa Blanca, as Frances Vasquez notes in some of her recent articles in the Press Enterprise. Isabel and Margarita Solorio, two women who brought a community petition to create a school in Casa Blanca where none had existed, and petitioning the school board to direct its resources to create a school for their community in service of their Mexican youth. And so they were able to successfully enter that space. They faced racial hostility, certainly, but ultimately the board agreed through the process of interest convergence. They wanted to maintain segregation. So they said, okay, let's build a school there to make sure that the youth stay in Casa Blanca, because they were traveling at least a mile to the Palm and Victoria schools, which were white schools. And so the school board was definitely into that. But these women and the community held the city accountable to direct its resources, as they were taxpayers just like everyone else, to do right by the students, to at least provide some sort of educational facility. And that was the Casa Blanca School's origin story. Now the Independiente school is a different story. This was created by a coalition of white parents in Arlington who petitioned the school board to get the Mexican students out of the Liberty School because it was believed that the Mexican students were holding back the education of the white students, and their presence was devaluing not only the education of whites, but devaluing the real estate of the community. And so their interest was in maintaining a separate space and getting those students out of there into their own school close to the citrus groves and the labor camps in Arlington, those labor camps being the Campo Modesto and Campo Pascual, as well as some emerging housing that was growing at the time, being built by Mexican workers and their families. And so here's one of the few images that exist of Independiente. It was a house converted to a school, the J.A. Logan Estate on Indiana, just next to the packing house and the groves. So they converted this house and then added old buildings from throughout the district to create this segregated Mexican school, siphoning off those Mexican students of Liberty, and then maintaining the white spatial imaginary of Arlington. And here we see the children of the Campo, and this image is donated by a longtime family of that area, the Robles family. And so here we see another rare image of this particular smaller, lesser known community of these cute little kids. Que lindos. Okay. Currently, the school is a site that has been raised. So these structures here are no longer there. It's just a dirt lot. And so it's no longer evident in the landscape as such as the Casa Blanca school, which is still there. With the curriculum that was implemented to manage, maintain, and reproduce a low-wage labor force came by way of Americanization. And so Americanization programs in these segregated schools flourished, not only in the school sites, but in community sites such as Riverside's Community Settlement House and other spaces where educators, church officials, and other social clubs like women's clubs and other entities throughout the city all got together and circulated a knowledge base around Americanization practices, and then developed an ecology of Americanization that functioned primarily in the schools, but also in other community sites in the households of the Mexican community and in churches, and then in settlement houses as well. And so here, as I mentioned, the focus of education for Mexican youth in these segregated spaces tended to center around hygiene, because it was believed that Mexicans were backward and dirty and hygiene risks. And so the Casa Blanca, Irving, and Independiente schools were the only school facilities that had washing, a washroom, bathtubs and showers for the children, which is part of that racialized curriculum and segregated space. And the curriculum also centered on English language acquisition, patriotism, and manual arts, connecting back to the idea of schooling fulfilling the function of reproducing a low-wage labor force, or the next generation as citrus laborers. And so here we see one of the teachers of the Independiente writing an article on a toy making project she implemented for her boys, for her students. But as the Depression sets in, the schools were formed and Americanization programs flourished, and the white citizens of Riverside rejoiced in their benevolence and the ways that they treated the Mexicans. But at the same time, with economic depression, you can basically count on attitudes towards non-white populations to take a dip as well. And this was the case as the Mexican problem really flared up and anti-immigrant, anti-Mexican racism informed policies toward these Mexican citrus labor communities, resulting in the deportation of 3,000 Mexicans from the Riverside and San Bernardino areas. But it's important to say that these structures and practices of racial domination were built into the landscape and implemented through pedagogy, curriculum, and also placemaking practices. It's also important to recognize that the Mexican-American community in particular also engaged in various practices of resilience and resistance. And so they resisted injustice in the labor industry, in particular through strikes and forming unions. Although they were never able to fully and successfully form a union, they engaged in strike and union organizing activity from the early 20th century on into the 30s. And this is an example of a strike in Corona in 1941. That was relatively successful in gaining these workers an increase in wages, but they're striking for better pay, better working conditions, and labor justice. And here we see an example of a call in English and Spanish for Redland citrus workers to organize. This is one of the few artifacts available of strike activity. And so these communities also engage in an education of their own, circulating unionization materials and knowledge of labor struggles and mobilization efforts. And so in informal spaces such as pool halls, baseball fields, these workers collectively organized and were able to develop campaigns to resist labor exploitation. And they even utilized music as evidenced here in this Corrido de la Huelga. And this is brought to us by Gilbert Gonzalez, historian. And this is one in particular related to the citrus industry that relates to striking and unionization efforts. But other ways they resisted and engaged in what's known by a term created by Renato Rosaldo, an anthropologist, a term referred to as cultural citizenship, were practices such as fiestas patrias. And Casa Blanca has one of the longest running Cinco de Mayo celebrations in California, spanning over, I think, at least 112 years. And so the communities have, in the face of Americanization and deculturalization curriculum, they created their own curriculum of cultural citizenship to preserve and perpetuate Mexicanidad or Mexicanness in their community, in informal spaces, in the streets, in the churches, and in the homes by sharing and transmitting this knowledge of Mexican culture and valuing it in these particular ways. And Fiestas Patrias were one of those ways of Mexican immigrants and Mexican Americans claiming space and then engaging in a counter story in the landscape to really signify Mexicanness as an important part of the community. So here we see this archival image. And part of that involved, they formed bands too, to claim space in terms of the audioscape. So not only physically, symbolically, but also in terms of the soundscape. They claim space and cultural citizenship as an act of resilience and the foundation for other resistance efforts. Mobilizing their cultural resources and their financial resources to create infrastructure that served them, such as the construction of churches by pooling all their resources and actually building, entrepreneurship, and then also fighting for the country that treated them as second-class citizens earning medals of valor, such as Smiley Ismael Villegas, who is commemorated in downtown Riverside with this statue here, but a man who grew up in Casa Blanca and then gave his life in service of a country that did not do right by his community, in the hopes of creating a type of place that would at some point enable equal rights. And other men joined the service, not only from Casa Blanca, but from the East Side. And also migration and immigration continued as we entered the war years, with the Bracero program having a significant impact in Riverside, an infusion of Mexican nationals who were utilized as a replacement labor force for those Mexican men who went off to fight in the war, and also work in other industries, war industries, which created a labor shortage in agriculture. And also to undermine labor strike activity, which was flaring up in the 30s. So the Bracero program was a way of driving the nail in the coffin of union organizing activities and labor strikes. This binational program facilitated by growers, but supported by US infrastructure and Mexican infrastructure to undermine labor rights. It created an infusion, and they were looked upon fondly and integrated into the existing Mexican-American communities in different ways, but also following the pattern of living in camps initially as they served their contracts, their temporary guest worker contracts. Camp Rubidoux, located where Fairmount Park is, but the structure is no longer in place. And then some staying to build a family. As we see here, Simona Valero, who will turn 100 years old this February, an activist in the community, but also a daughter of a citrus worker, marrying a bracero, John Valero here, and we see his contract, his bracero contract in the middle, the document that brings them together in the flow of history and the community of Riverside. To this day, though, the memories of the Mexican-American community in Riverside are preserved by members of these communities, such as Tesoros de Casa Blanca. Here we see Roberto Murillo and Frances Vasquez, who are leaders of the organization, preserving the memories and archival materials of the community of Casa Blanca as a historic preservation. And also other organizations such as Spanish Town Heritage Foundation and Riverside County Mexican American Historical Society to disrupt the settler imaginary and engage in memory work that provides a counter narrative to the fantasy heritage of Riverside, and to create ultimately a Latinx spatial imaginary in the region. Okay.
All right. Thank you so much, Professor Moreno-Terrill. Folks, like, you could do the little clap emoji or just unmute and clap. So that was an incredibly informative talk. It uncovered a lot of hidden history, and I could just tell from the chat that it was resonating with a lot of you, right? We learned a whole lot about the ways that white supremacy manifested in different segregated schools and communities and housing, but then also how resistance and joy to some of those policies and sort of like making place. So that's really great. We do have time for maybe one or two, maybe one question. We're going to do a quick transition into our breakout rooms, and there what we're going to be able to do is just really share with you some of the resources we have. And we'll share the slides with you after this so that you can take advantage of some of the links. Anybody have a question for Professor Moreno-Terrill?
And I'm just looking over the chat. And sorry for running a little over. Okay.
Well, I just want to highlight that somebody was like, this is awesome. I now like want to do more local history in the area that I teach. That's really, we're very excited to hear that. That's great. We all think that there's a lot of themes in history in your communities that connect some of the things that are in the textbooks, but that sort of like feature the Midwest, so the East Coast. So thank you so much.